Mr. President, Friday's Washington Post reported that Secretary Sebelius of the Department of Health and Human Services has, quote, gone hat in hand to health industry executives, asking them to make large financial donations to help with the effort to implement President Obama's landmark health care law, end of quote. I ask consent to include in the record the Washington Post article following my remarks.
Without objection.
The article further said that the, quote, unusual fundraising push comes after Congress has repeatedly rejected the administration's request for additional funds to set up the Affordable Health Care Act. The article said many of the Secretary's calls have recruited support for Enroll America, described as the most prominent nonprofit working on the health care law's implementation. Its president, Ann Philippic, the article goes on to say, joined the group in January after service as White House Deputy Director for Public Engagement. Today, the New York Times included an article by Robert Peer, Cabinet Secretary solicits large donations to publicize health care law. I ask consent to include the article following my remarks.
Without objection.
In the article, it said Mrs. Sebelius has made calls soliciting support from the healthcare industry, including insurance and pharmaceutical executives. A spokesman for Ms. Sebelius says she suggested that healthcare executives and others support the work of Enroll America, a private nonprofit group that shares the president's goal of securing coverage for people without insurance. An insurance executive said that some insurers have been asked for $1 million in donations. An insurance executive said that. And the bigger companies, the article says, have been asked for a lot more. Administration's officials said private donations were needed because Congress had provided much less money than Mr. Obama requested to publicize the new law and get people enrolled in health care plans subsidized by the government. The article further talks about Ms. Philippic. She worked on Mr. Obama's 2008 campaign. She was Deputy Director of the Democratic National Committee. She worked in the Obama White House as a Deputy for Public Engagement. She said her time is not political in her work for Enroll America. She says, we're thrilled to be working with the Secretary Sebelius and to have her support. Several executives who received these calls for money said they were uncomfortable with the discussions because the federal government has the power to approve or reject the health plans they want to sell an insurance market that will be run by federal officials in 30 states. Mr. Secretary, Secretary Sebelius is fundraising for and coordinating with private entities helping to implement the new health care law may be illegal, should cease immediately, and should be fully investigated by Congress. Later this week, I'll be sending a letter with several of my colleagues to the Government Accountability Office asking them to examine the issue. We'll be asking the GAO to examine the amount of coordination between the Department of Health and Human Services and Enroll America, and whether Secretary Sebelius is trying to do through a private entity activities that Congress has refused to allow the department to do. Such private fundraising, as these articles describe, circumvents the constitutional requirement that only Congress may appropriate funds. If the Secretary and others in her department are closely coordinating with the activities of Enroll America, which is headed by the former White House aide, then those actions may be in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The limits of the Anti-Deficiency Act were fully explored by Congress during the Iran-Contra incident when Reagan administration official Oliver North raised funds and directed their spending through private entities in support of Nicaraguan rebels, even though Congress had refused to appropriate such funds. This produced a select joint committee of the Congress, including many of its most distinguished members, the Iran-Contra Joint Select Committee. The Senate ranking members were Senator Inouye and Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire. The House leaders were Lee Hamilton and Dick Cheney, who was the ranking Republican. The report of the Select Iran Committee, Senate Report number 100-216 at page 413 said, quote, the constitutional plan, referring to the United States Constitution, does not prohibit the president from urging other countries to give money directly to the Contras, the rebel group in Nicaragua. But the Constitution does prohibit receipt and collection of such funds by this government absent an appropriation. This prohibition may not be evaded by use of a nominally private entity if the entity is in reality an arm of the government and the government is able to direct how the money is spent. The report also said, quote, Congress' exclusive control over the expenditure of funds cannot legally be evaded through the use of gifts or donations to the executive branch. Were it otherwise, a president whose appropriation requests were rejected by Congress could raise money through private sources or from other countries for armies, military actions, armed systems, or even domestic programs. Let me read this again. This is the Joint Committee, Senator Inouye, Senator Rudman, members of the House, bipartisan. Were it otherwise, a president whose appropriations requests were rejected by Congress could raise money through private sources or from other countries for armies, military actions, armed systems, or even domestic programs. That's page 412, page 413 of the Joint Iran-Contra Select Committee report. Friday's Washington Post reported that the Secretary's spokesman said that Sebelius is working with private entities on, quote, our mission, unquote, of implementing health care law activities, although Congress has refused to appropriate more funds. If the Department of Human Services closely coordinates with Enroll America and with other such entities, then the analogy with Iran-Contra is strong. It's hard for me to see, Mr. President, the difference. There's a difference in where Oliver North got his money in 1985, 6, and 7 with Iran-Contra. It was some of it came from the hostages for arms sale. But the question is not as much where the money comes from, although in this case, the Secretary may be raising it from people she regulates, which could also be illegal. The question is where the money is going. And in the case of Iran-Contra, the money was going to a private entity supporting a rebel army in Nicaragua in contravention of the Boland Amendment passed by Congress. In other words, Congress had said no, and the administration did it anyway. And that's precisely, it seems to me, what's happening here. Congress has said no, we're not going to appropriate any more money or as much as you want to implement the health care law, and the Secretary appears to be raising money from people she regulates to give it to private entities with whom she coordinates to do what Congress has refused to do. Now, Mr. President, the problem with that first is the Constitution of the United States, which gives the power of the purse to the United States Congress, Article 1. Number 2, there is a federal law that says that you can't do through private entities what Congress has refused to do. That's called the anti-deficiency law. And 3, there's some federal laws about raising money from people you regulate for whatever purpose. The Secretary activities may violate those federal laws prohibiting raising private funds from those she regulates. Federal law permits a narrow band of private fundraising activities, but this has always been interpreted very narrowly. And this would not be the first violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act by the Secretary's HHS. The General Accountability Office found HHS in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act 3 times last year. I'm most concerned, Mr. President, that the Secretary's actions reflect a deep disregard running throughout the administration for the constitutional role of the elected representatives in the legislative branch. We saw it in the President's decision in January of 2012 to bypass the Senate's role of advice and consent and make appointments, recess appointments, which are authorized by the Constitution at a time when the Senate said it wasn't in recess. A federal court quickly ruled these appointments were unconstitutional because the Senate was not in recess. But the individuals continue to show up at the National Labor Relations Board and pretend they have the authority to issue decisions. We see this in the number of executive orders that the President has used to circumvent Congress on issues as important as immigration enforcement, and in the number of czars whose responsibilities are intended for roles that need the Senate's advice and consent. We see it in the Department of Education, where the Secretary is turning a simple waiver authority in No Child Left Behind into a conditional waiver, with the Secretary using his authority to make decisions that should be made by Congress or should be made locally by state and local governments. The HHS Secretary's actions may follow an administration pattern, but in this case, it's in a pattern that appears it may be illegal, and it demands investigation. So I will be, as I said, with other members of Congress later this week, sending a letter to the Government Accountability Office asking them to look at these facts. Mr. President, I would like to read a few paragraphs from the Iran-Contra report that was issued by the Joint Select Committee, Democrats and Republicans, in the late 1980s. The Constitution contemplates that the government will conduct its affairs only with funds appropriated by Congress. By resorting to funds not appropriated by Congress, indeed funds denied the executive branch by Congress, administration officials committed a transgression far more basic than a violation of the Boland Amendment. That was the amendment that said you can't use federal dollars to support rebels in Nicaragua. The power of the purse, continued the Joint Select Committee. This was a bipartisan report, but it was written at a time when we had a Democratic Congress. The power of the purse, which the framers vested in Congress, has long been recognized as the most important simple curb in the Constitution on presidential power. The framers were determined not to combine the power of the purse and the power of the sword in the same branch of government. The constitutional process that lodges control of government expenditures exclusively in Congress is the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits an officer of the United States from authorizing an expenditure that has not been the subject of a congressional appropriation or that exceeds the amount of any applicable appropriation. Thus, the Anti-Deficiency Act provides an officer or employee of the United States government may not make or authorize an expenditure or obligation exceeding an amount available in an appropriation or fund for the appropriate expenditure or obligation, or involve the government in a contract or obligation for the payment of money before an appropriation is made unless authorized by law. Mr. President, I ask consent to include, following my remarks, these excerpts from the Joint Committee's report. Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution, which says no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of an appropriation made by law. And then two other things. One is the purported authority that the Secretary's spokesman is citing for her actions in raising money. I haven't seen the authority from raising money from people she regulates, but 42 U.S.C. Section 300 U1A talks about grants and contracts for research programs and says the Secretary is authorized to conduct and support by grant or contract, parentheses, and encourage others to support, close parentheses, research in health information and health promotion, preventive health services, and education in the appropriate use of health care. Applications for grants and contracts under this section shall be subject to appropriate peer review. Mr. President, this small section relates to support for contracts for research of information programs in the form of grants or contracts. The parenthetical language, encourage others to support, has to be read as encouraging others to support such programs. It is far-fetched to say that it gives the Secretary authority to encourage third parties to give money to nonprofits providing Obamacare information that the Department of Health and Human Services cannot fund directly because Congress has refused to appropriate. This small section and the words in parentheses cannot amend the Constitution of the United States and invalidate Article 1. this section cannot supersede the Anti-Deficiency Act, according to the language of the Bipartisan Joint Committee. There is obviously a way, Mr. President, to have appropriate public-private contracts. We have them all throughout government, public-private associations to try to improve our country. We do that with HIV/AIDS. We do it with a whole variety of things. When I was Education Secretary, I worked with the first President Bush to set up the New American Schools Development Corporation, which encouraged a private corporation headed by a former New Jersey Governor Tom Kean, which would raise money to create models for private schools. And then later on, President Bush, the first, asked Congress to do some things in support of those schools. And all of us encouraged that. But that was quite different. That was an effort that would be typical of many public-private partnerships that the federal government is involved in, where in this case we said, we want to encourage the support of model schools. Here is a private corporation that's doing that. We encourage that. Congress wasn't objecting to that. Congress hadn't said you can't do that. Congress hadn't been asked to vote on an appropriation for the New American Schools Development Corporation. And Congress had not said you can't do that. So that would be true with dozens, maybe hundreds of public-private partnerships between the federal government and private organizations for the same goal. But what we're talking about, Mr. President, and why the analogy between what Secretary Sebelius is doing and what Oliver North was doing in the Reagan administration in the late 1980s is so strong, is that in each case, the money seems to be raised privately and spent through private entities for a function that Congress has refused to appropriate money for. It's not so much where the money came from, it's more where the money's going. And the Constitution itself, in Article 1, makes it absolutely clear that no one can appropriate dollars for a federal program other than the United States Congress. And a subterfuge that goes around that, seeks to go around that by raising private money, putting it in private entities for the same purpose that Congress has either refused to appropriate money for or said that you can't do, that is outside the Constitution. It's not allowed by the Constitution of the United States, and it's against the Anti-Deficiency Act. And then there's a separate question of whether it's appropriate to raise money from people that the Secretary regulates. So, Mr. President, I'm deeply concerned about this. Hope the Secretary will stop this action. Hope the public-private partnerships that we have throughout government will continue where they're appropriate. But we need for the executive branch of government to show proper respect to the people of this country who elect their members of Congress. We are Article 1, they are Article 2. The purpose of the power of appropriation is to put a curb on the executive branch. And if the Congress says no, then the executive cannot spend money, nor can the executive go through a subterfuge of private organizations and private fundraising in support of the very same objective that Congress has refused to approve. In this case, the Secretary seems to say that the reason they're doing that is because Congress has refused to appropriate more money to implement the health care law. That seems to me to be just admitting a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, admitting a violation of the proper division of responsibilities in the Constitution. Yes, the Congress has refused to do that, but that's the Congress privilege to do that. And when the Congress does that, the administration may not proceed to spend the money that the Congress hasn't authorized, whether directly through the government or indirectly through private entities. So later this week, we'll be asking the General Accountability Office, the Government Accountability Office, to look into these facts. I'm sure we'll be hearing more about it. And I would hope that in the meantime, the Secretary will stop making the phone calls, stop coordinating with private entities to do things that Congress has specifically refused to do. I thank the President. I yield the floor. Oh, Mr. President, may I vitiate the quorum? I ask to add to the list of articles at the end of my remarks a article published July 9, 1991, Bush sets up foundation to start model schools as an example of an appropriate way to have a public-private partnership or a private enterprise that is encouraged by the government, but not in a way that seeks to do something that the Congress has refused to do.
Without objection.
I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call a roll.
Mr. Alexander.